Welcome back. We are continuing chapter 10 with section 10.6 on salts. So some learning objectives for this section is we'd like you to know the general characteristics of a salt and then classify a substance as a salt based on its chemical formula. So a salt is an ionic compound containing a metal or a polyatomic ion as the positive ion and a non-metal or a polyatomic ion as the negative ion. So it's pretty much any ionic compound except ones that contain hydroxide as the anion, because if an ionic compound contains hydroxide as the anion, then it's classified as a base, not as a salt. So we went over the formula, how to write formulas and nomenclature for salts and ionic compounds in sections 4.7 and 4.9. We covered polyatomic ions in section 4.10. And the solubility of ionic compounds, using the solubility rules to predict if an ionic compound is going to dissolve in water, whether it will be soluble, or if it won't dissolve in water, if it will be insoluble, was covered in section 8.4. So we've already talked a lot about salts without actually just calling them salts. So we want you to be able to, based on the chemical formula, identify if something's a salt. And again, it will have a metal or a polyatomic ion as the positive ion, and a non-metal or a polyatomic ion is the negative ion, except if hydroxide is the negative ion, then it will be classified as a base and not as a salt. So all common soluble salts are completely dissociated into ions in solution. So what this means is if you identify something as a salt, you would check the solubility rules to see if it's going to be soluble or not. And if it is soluble, if it will dissolve in water, when it does dissolve in water, it's going to completely separate into its ions. So there aren't weak and strong salts like there are weak and strong acids and bases. You know, like a strong acid completely ionizes and a weak acid only partially ionizes. With salts, they completely dissociate. They completely break up into their respective ions. So even if a salt is only slightly soluble, the part that does dissolve is still going to completely dissociate into ions. So this is what that looks like if a salt is soluble. When it's put into aqueous solution, it's going to completely separate into its ions. So there's not going to be any just, some of the ions dissociate, some of the ions don't, like with a weak base or a weak acid. Salts are all kind of the equivalent of a strong acid or a strong base. They completely break apart into their ions. If a salt is not 100% soluble, some salts are just slightly soluble, meaning they won't completely dissolve, but the part that does dissolve is going to completely dissociate into its ions. Okay, so that was it for section 10.6. It's a very short one because a lot of the information on salts has already been covered in previous chapters. The key here is to be able to identify an ionic compound as a salt. And again, it's going to be essentially any ionic compound except for the ones that contain hydroxide, and those will be classified as bases. Okay, we'll talk next about acid-base neutralization reactions. Thanks.